So my title is 5 Points of Inquiry about Context, Culture, and the Group Experience. And I'm going to start with a couple of rhetorical questions. The first one, which is, who do you see up here? As you look at me, do you think about me as a woman, as an academic, as a Latina, or as a Texan? Some of you are from Texas, or at least one of you is, and we've shared that identity. The bottom line is I'm one stimulus, one person, but likely there are multiple perceptions out there from each of you about who I am or what I am. Now, what do I see when I look out there? Do I look at you as members of different gender groups? Do I think about your cultural backgrounds? Or do I really think about you in terms of your academic discipline, your background? And beyond that, one more rhetorical question. As persons, and as members of different cultural groups, are we inclined to, or can we be primed to focus on similarities between ourselves and others? Or do we focus on differences? And what role does context play in this? If we consider the physical context or the social context at any given point in time, what is the construal of difference as a function of that context? So when we think about people within cultures, or we think about different cultures that exist, how is difference conceptualized as a function of those different settings? So my point of inquiry number one is, what is the construal of difference, both within cultures and then across cultures, as people observe one another? Now, in my research, I study difference, but I study a very peculiar, or particular, I should say, instance of difference. And mostly I look at tokenism. And I treat tokenism simply from a numerical perspective. So tokenism is operationalized in my lab work in terms of having a group of 4 people come together to engage in some task. And the token is the one person out of those 4 who is different. So I have groups comprised of 4 people who are the same on whatever the dimension may be. Sometimes it's gender. So in a non-token situation, there's 4 males, there's 4 females. In a token situation, there's 1 female with 3 males, or 1 male with 3 females. But as well, I've looked at what happens in the case of tokenism as a function of ethnicity, so Latinos, Caucasians, and even sometimes looked at tokenism when people don't even look different, they just recognize they're different. So school affiliation. The other 3 members are either members of your school or they're members of a rival school. But they really don't look any different from you. And what I've found is consistent with what other research in this area have found, and sometimes they refer to their tokens as marginals or solos. But the bottom line is whether you're talking about memory as the dependent variable, so you have a group interaction, then you ask them to remember what was said, not only by others, but also by themselves. Sometimes it's about spatial design, recreating patterns that they've been shown. Other times it's about solving anagrams. You mix up words and they unscramble the letters to recreate the word. And the general finding is extremely robust, and what you get is deficits as a function of being a token. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Latina female or a privileged white Caucasian male. It doesn't matter whether you go to St. Mary's or Notre Dame, because sometimes we used to comprise the groups that way. The bottom line is simply that being put in that position of being different yields cognitive deficits. And why do they happen? Well, primarily because there's this self-presentational response that occurs when you find yourself to be different in a group. You sit there thinking things like, I'm different. What do they think of me? How am I coming across? And all of those thoughts require attention. Attention is diverted away from the central task. And so if attention goes here, then attention goes down over here, and you perform poorly. So over the past few decades that I've done this work, I thought, this is very robust. But sometimes, many of us, myself included, privilege science and the findings from science over lived experience. So a funny thing happened a few years back when Sonia Sotomayor was being nominated to be a Supreme Court justice. And in fact, during those proceedings, she was accused of being a racist and sexist because she had made a statement years earlier at a lecture at the Berkeley Law School, which went something like, certainly a wise Latina with the richness of her experiences would reach a better decision than a majority white male. And when she gave this lecture, she was speaking in terms of what the context is for women and judges of color on judiciary panels. And they are very few in number. So although she wasn't talking about it in terms of tokenism, she was making the argument there are so few, but what they bring is really important. And what they do is actually high performance relative to their majority white males. Now you can see why she was accused of being racist and sexist. But more importantly for me, that statement alone resonated as truth. It resonated as her lived truth, but it also resonated as my own lived truth. So point of inquiry number 2 was, do I privilege science over lived experience? Point of inquiry 3 is, I do believe in science, but a science that focuses on inclusive knowledge building rather than reductionistic knowledge building. So how do I reconcile science with lived experience? Well, to me, what she said posed a puzzle. And I thought, I've got to figure out what the difference is. Why do we have this body of work, but I know that this is the truth over here? I did a review of the literature, not just my work, but other people's. And what I came to see quite clearly was that the dependent variables that we use, the performance tasks, all require linear thinking. Very simple tasks, very direct thinking. But if you think of the judiciary, it requires so much more. It requires a higher level of perspective taking and social creativity, where you have to take the perspective of the plaintiff, the defendant, case law, your other colleagues on the panel, and yourself. And you have to really consider and weigh those comparably if you're going to do a good job at adjudication. So I thought that's what it is. Therein lies the secret. I know that my tokens, because I take measures, are concerned with the perspective that others have of them. And so for them, it's easy to step into the shoes of others and look at other perspectives. And non-tokens don't have to do that. They're in a position of privilege. They see the world as it really is. At least that's the way they think. But tokens are concerned about what everybody else's perspective is. So if they're given a task that requires perspective taking, like adjudication in the courtroom, then they're already primed to do this. This is their worldview. So I decided to replicate the past work using the same paradigm, 4 people in a group. But this time the task involved solving interpersonal dilemmas. So what happens when you have 2 parties in conflict and you have to resolve that conflict? And there are 2 ways to solve that conflict, 2 conceptual ways. One is to be linear and non-integrated and say, I choose this perspective, or I choose that perspective. But the second way is really to think about both perspectives, to compromise, to synthesize, and to come up with a solution that will meet some of the needs of both parties, but not ignore one or the other. So we gave them a series of interpersonal dilemmas in a group again, asked them to solve them, and we measured the number of solutions that were non-integrated or very linear, and also the number of solutions generated that were more integrated, that are better solutions to these puzzles, to these conflicts. And lo and behold, now I have to use my hand, so I'm going to set this down. When we counted the number of non-integrated solutions, we got the same pattern that we had for decades. Non-tokens generated this many, and tokens generated this many. So that's the token deficit effect that we typically get. But when we looked at their production of integrated solutions, this is the more complex thinking, we got a total reversal. And tokens outperformed the non-tokens. So in this case, we got a token surfeit effect. This is very exciting to me. And it very much is in line with Megan and what you found with your participants. And so for me, point of inquiry number 4 is it the case that culture really gives human groups opportunities to be flexible, to be creative about the environment, the physical environment, and the social environment, so they respond differently? And ecology as a whole drives us, in some instances, to have similar responses, leading to homogeneity on some domains, but allows us to reach differential conclusions and differential pathways, or heterogeneity. So point of inquiry number 4 is, does culture give us opportunities that we as scientists aren't conceptualizing as opportunities? And point of inquiry number 5, so are there universals? And can I really talk about my group as a culture? Well, I think of it as a microcosm of a culture, with fault lines in the token condition, but without fault lines in the non-token condition. And I will say that, in fact, organisms respond to difference in a universal way. Even sea slugs orient to novel stimuli in their environment. That's early work done way back in the 50s. And it turns out that humans obviously also recognize difference, not just in the environment around them. We do know that tokens attract a lot of attention and they're very memorable. But what this work suggests is that humans recognize when they're the different one. And it makes a big difference in how they perceive the situation, in how they perceive the self, and in how they perform. So sometimes tokenism will lead to deficits, sometimes surfeits. But it's important to take into account the context and the task. So I'll wrap up by saying, life is so beautifully complex. And I think we would all benefit by engaging in inclusive knowledge building. It may be costly to capture that cultural complexity, but failure to do so, I would argue, is even costlier. And I'll finish with a cultural maxim that was taught to me by my mother. So this is the culture part, transmission to the next generation. And I'll give it to you in English so I don't have to translate from Spanish. But she used to tell me, she's my first and most important teacher. She used to say, doing things right is far more important than doing things quickly or doing only things that are easy. So this Latina endorses, and hope you do as well, that we take this maxim that my mother so lovingly shared with me and embrace it as a universal aspiration. Thank you.